Okay, so the last time we talked about the basic formal element of space, and before that we talked about line, and now we're going to discuss chapter 5, light and color. And for this lecture, we're only going to cover the first part of the chapter, which is primarily on light. So light and color are like they always interact together because light affects color, color affects light. Well, it doesn't, but light affects color. And light can help define spatial relationships in two-dimensional work. It can, like with light, direct light creates highlights or brighter areas on the object, and the less light, the darker that part of the object will appear. So if we were looking at these spheres or this cube and they were all the same value, all the same lightness or darkness, like if this was all white, this would not appear to be three-dimensional. It would appear to be a shape. But so when you're drawing or painting, you want to create the illusion of how much or how little light is hitting the surface of an object. And by doing that, you make it look more three-dimensional. So for example, with this cube, you have to really squint your eyes to look at this. But in this instance, the side is getting the most light. The top is getting almost the same amount of light, but a little less. And this side that faces us is not getting that direct light. So the light is coming from over here and hitting the surface of the cube, but not hitting this back area. And then the cube itself is casting a shadow, which is an area where no light is getting through. So light affects the way we see colors. So if you're outside and it's a dark night, the red on this car is going to appear darker than if you're outside at noon and the sun is at its highest and the car's getting the most light. And then fluorescent light's going to make it look different. At sunset, the color's going to look different. Some of you don't have the receptors, enough receptors in your eyes to see the differences between these variants of red, but some of you will be able to see it. And I apologize to those who can't, but I can't really do anything about the way your eyes are. So we all know this. We know light affects how you feel, your emotions. So like in Norway, in the land of the midnight sun, I had a friend that lived over there, and during the time period where there was very little light, people had to take antidepressants, or they now use these lights that they attach to their heads, which mimic sunlight. But you know, you get, if it's dark and gray and gloomy, you know, you're more likely to want to sleep or be down than if the sun is out and bright. So architects, they, above everyone, they know how much light can affect productivity. And you know, like my office that I'm in right now doesn't have a window, and I kind of hate it, but I'm doing the best I can. But you know, like if you have windows, that the sun's coming through, it kind of like cheers you up and invigorates you. Although for people like me who have ADD, I would stare out the window all the time and not get any work done. So like, you know, our buildings have a lot of windows, but it wasn't always that way, in part because the people didn't know how to construct buildings in such a way that they could support large windows. So we're going to talk about a kind of architecture called Romanesque, and the Romanesque period was around 1075 to 1125 AD, more or less. So it was called Romanesque because it was inspired by Roman architecture. Usually the buildings were symmetrically balanced, where the left and right sides were mirrors of one another. because they were using stones, they had to use like really, really heavy stones or masonry to build the walls in order to like hold up the roof, or if they were lucky and had an extra floor to hold that up. They were not able to have a lot of windows, and the windows they had to be really small, because if you cut a big window into the stone, then that building is not going to be structurally sound. It's going to, like, the stones above will collapse. These buildings had dark interiors. We'll see that in a minute. They, in order to hold up the roof, they had to have these really big, thick columns, which impeded, you know, like it meant that there was little usable space in the building. They had these rounded, they're also called Roman arches. We're going to see what a barrel vault is in a minute. And they were mostly built of stone, brick, or limestone, and then a lot of times they had wooden roofs. So here's an example of a little church that this is as big as the window is going to get in this little Romanesque church, because like I said, it's not going to be able to be structurally sound if they cut out too large of a opening. Here's an example of the like big, thick. These are, if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to see what's on them. I believe they're Doric columns, but they might be Corinthian, and we'll learn about those in another chapter. So like if you're sitting in this pew right here, you're going to have a hard time seeing the priest at the front of this building. And so like the aisles were really narrow, so there's not a lot of space they can use in here. And those buildings, like, so they didn't have electricity, obviously. There's only a little light coming in them. The priest is, you know, like smoking the place up using a censer. Back then, in the winter, they had to heat it with these big barrels of peat. And then during the bubonic plague, people believed that there was something called a miasma, like these poisonous fumes in the air. So then they even even had like more barrels of peat, and sometimes like bitumen, which is an oil byproduct, like lit and smoking to kill the poisonous air. So you could just imagine it's like smoky, kind of stinky, and dark in these places. Here's a picture, because this is what cell phones look like back then. I'm kidding, they didn't have cell phones. So the next architectural and artistic period after the Romanesque is called the Gothic period. And they got the term from the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Visigoths that invaded Europe, and they played a role in the fall of the Roman Empire. But like who knows why people who named that architectural period Gothic, who knows why they picked it, because the Goths were not really known for architectural achievements. They lived in like mud huts with thatch roofs, and yet for some reason it was named the Gothic period. So the Gothic period began, this is the one instance when we can say exactly when a period of architecture began. And because most of the time it sort of fluctuates and we don't really know when it started, but in this case we know it began in 1140 AD with the renovation of Saint-Denis Basilica in Paris by Abbot Suger. And this introduced a new era in building design. But before we talk about that, we're going to talk about Saint-Denis, that the basilica is named after. So Saint-Denis was among a group of people who, like missionaries, thank you, that's the word, who went to all of these pagan countries, like what is now France, what is now Ireland, what is now England, to convert people who had these pagan religions to Catholicism. So Saint-Denis, he went with a group of missionaries into Paris, and they were highly successful, especially Saint-Denis, in converting people to this new faith. So the authorities were like, we gotta stop these guys, because we kind of like our religion that we have already. And so they captured and imprisoned Saint-Denis and these other monks, and they tortured them in every which way but loose, all sorts of ways. They barbecued them, they tied them at the stake and burnt them. They like stretched them. I forgot what the thing. It's a device where they stretch them out. They even cut off their heads. They decapitated them. But Saint-Denis, he was determined not to die. So when they cut off his head, he picked it up and he walked several miles. Every once in a while, he'd wash his head in water. And then after I think it's like 3 miles or something, he fell down dead. And the place where he fell down dead was where they built the first Saint-Denis church or chapel. And before it was Saint-Denis, it had been a Gallo-Roman cemetery. The Saint-Denis Abbey was erected in 475 AD, and then it became a basilica in the 7th century AD, which the basilica is like kind of a central, more important church than just the regular abbeys. And then it became a pilgrimage site, because apparently they had that's not Saint-Denis there. They had the remains of Saint-Denis there, and people would go on like these religious pilgrimages to all these churches throughout the land. And then in the 10th century, it was renovated again. This is before the Gothic, in that Romanesque style. And it was a place where, for centuries, they buried the kings and queens of France. And it was completely dark, and it was cramped, and it had those thick columns and tiny windows. And then Abbot Suger came along, and he was instructed to make this place a more befitting place to bury the kings and queens. And his renovations for Saint-Denis were inspired by someone known as Dionysius the Areopagite. And Dionysius, in his writings, he said, oh, by the way, let me back up. So this is who he's inspired by, although he thought that these writings of Dionysius were by Saint-Denis, but they weren't. So Dionysius believed that God was the light coming from the sun, and that people were the little lights of God. And so the way that Suger interpreted this is that in order to let in the light of heaven, a church must be well lit, because then it allows for a communication and a contemplation of God. So we'll talk about what these renovations were, but it moved from, this is not Saint-Denis, but it moved from a church that was more or less like this, that was, like just like 1 or 2 stories, to like a several story church that had more usable space in it, and was, as he felt, was more befitting for the kings and queens. And it took a really long time to build this church. So his renovations included a new addition to the front building, smaller columns, Gothic arches, a choir. This this area is like called an ambulatory, which is where the pilgrims would walk and then look at all these relics of saints and otherwise. And so now I'm going to just like illustrate this more. So before the kind of arches they had in this building were these kind of round ones, and those round arches, in the form that they were built out of masonry and brick, they couldn't get very large, and there weren't very large openings. But then in the new church, they did this new style of pointed arch, which was actually a style borrowed from Islamic architecture. So now we have this pointed arch, which these can go up higher and they can be wider spaces. They don't have to have as thick a columns. So it's like the Gothic arch is, I already said some of this, but structurally sound or allows for thinner columns, frees up more space. The columns can rise higher and there's larger openings. And with these larger openings, they place stained glass, which before stained glass, we'll learn about it later, but had only been maybe used in the homes of the wealthy. The Romans, like wealthy people in Rome even back in the day, had stained glass. And now with the new Gothic arch, they're starting to place the stained glass in there, and the stained glass also reflects the belief that you need to let the heavenly light into the church. So that now this becomes a much larger, more workable space. Here's some examples of the stained glass, and I want to tell you something about what happened because of all of this light coming into the church, but I'm going to wait till I get through with this. So here are those barrel vaults that were created by the Roman arches, and in these you still have to have kind of small windows. And now with the Gothic arch, what you get is a groin vault, or it's also called a rib vault, which is stronger, lets in more light, goes up higher. So also like the building got more stories and the taller windows. And anyway, so like all this light is coming into the church, and there is a belief that there's a correlation between the schism between the Catholic Church and the newly formed Protestant Church. And that is because people, like in the past, when you're in this little dark church, you go to the priest communicates with God. But in these new churches with all this light coming in, people started realizing that I personally am connected to and communicate with God. And that was one of the things that maybe indirectly, but led to the split between the Catholic and the Protestant religion. So now we're going to talk about light. So we were talking about three-dimensional things then. And now we're going to talk about like how do artists drawing on a two-dimensional surface or painting on a two-dimensional surface or making a print on a two-dimensional surface, how do they use light to create the illusion of three dimensions? So back during the Renaissance, 14th to the 18th century, it's really not that long of a period. I mean, it was, like a lot of the Renaissance stuff was going on in the late 15th, 16th century. So Renaissance means rebirth. And during that period, for a number of reasons, there began this renewed interest in classical scholarship and values. That's because a lot of this like information came from when they were excavating Rome, parts of Italy and Greece, but also because after the when the Islamic conquest of many parts of North Africa, Middle East, Spain, the Arab scholars brought in tons and tons of all the scientific, medical, mathematical information. And it started making the people in Europe like start thinking and reading these texts and incorporating them into the way they thought about things. So during the Renaissance, it was really, for artists, it was really important to depict the world realistically. And some of the ways they did this was through 1 or 2 point linear perspective. Some of the ways was like, because a lot of medical scientific information came over from the Arab countries. And so now there's like this better understanding of anatomy. And Leonardo da Vinci, this is him right here, he felt it was also, in order to depict a realistic environment, you had to create the illusion of real lighting conditions. So he started experimenting, and even though he wasn't the first person to use this, he was the first person to formulate the use of atmospheric perspective. And that's a perspective technique. So by perspective, I mean like the artist is making things look like this real sense of space, deep space, and not a flat surface. So with atmospheric perspective, he noticed that in real life, the further out you look, the more, and he lived in this mountainous area, mountainous and hilly areas. So the further out you look, the less distinct things started blurring. A lot of times the further out you looked, the more like the bluer or cooler in color they were. And there was also a greatly reduced contrast in relative values. And what do I mean by that? There was like, so when we look at things up close, we notice lights and darks and all those different values in between. We notice like distinctions in color, although like, look at this landscape, everything's the same color. But when we're up close to things, we can tell, you know, clearly what color they are, how light or dark they are. Like, you know, the more light that's hitting something, the lighter it's going to be, the less light it's hitting something, the more in shadow it's going to be. But then as you go further and further and further back, what I want you to do right now is squint your eyes and then look at this landscape. And when you squint your eyes, everything starts to blur together. And that in the background, and that means there's not very much contrast between light and dark, that they're all relatively close in value to one another. But you squint your eyes and look at the foreground, you can just see those distinctions between how light and dark something is. So Da Vinci, he translated this to painting, and what he would do is when things were up close, he would paint them the colors he believed them to be. And then the further back they got, the more blue he added to the color and the more white he added to the color. So then like they become like bluer and lighter and closer in value to one another. Like I said, this technique had been used before. This painting by Raphael is 1505. This painting of the yarn winder is like just 5 years before, but people had been using this, and then Da Vinci, like he's the first person that codified, wrote it down, formulated it. So like lots of artists over the ages who are doing representational, realistic looking work incorporate this atmospheric perspective into their paintings so that the further away things are, the less distinct, the bluer, cooler the colors are, and the less contrast and values between colors. So now we're going to talk about an artist that for a period of time almost entirely wholly relied on a form of atmospheric perspective where nothing's really distinct. And this guy is J.M.W. Turner. And this painting by him is called, he always had like these really elaborate names for his paintings. It's Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway. He did this in 1884. And I'm just going to briefly describe it, and then we're going to move to how, and look what time period this, 1884. So this is really unusual for the time. It's really abstract. And how did it get here? So in this painting, we have a little river, and there's a little bridge, and there's a little guy. He's floating down the river and fishing. And in our terms for today, that little guy is me. I'm old, and I'm, I kind of like the slower pace of things. And then on this right side of the painting, we have a railroad track and a steam locomotive barreling down the track. These, you can barely see them. That's a rabbit. There's another rabbit here, and those rabbits are just running the hell out of the way so they don't get run over. And that steaming railroad, that locomotive going like 1,000,000 miles an hour down the track, that's you, because you accept new technology much more quickly than somebody my age does. You're like open to new ideas and new ways of doing things. So this sort of, the reason he did this is that he just painted this to show that times were really accelerating and changing because of new technology, and you better like get on speed with that new technology, or you're going to be like those rabbits and you're going to get run over. So how did he get there? Okay, so he lived in England, and much further away in Indonesia, there was a volcano called Mount Tambora. And in 1850, it erupts and erupts and erupts. And it was like, at that time, it's the greatest eruption in human memory. 12,000 people die in a single day. There's a tsunami and like on the island of Sumbawa and other islands nearby, over 100,000 people die, which back then is a lot of people. And I hate to say this, but it's comparable to how many people have died of coronavirus here. I'm recording this in May 2020. So all this erupting volcano lava and ash and etc., the ash goes out into the atmosphere. It doesn't just stay in Indonesia. It travels to the, I believe, to the east. It I'm sorry, to the west. So it goes to Asia, Europe, on to North America. It causes red snow to fall in some areas. This eruption of this volcano inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So the summer of 1816, the following summer after this eruption, because this ash is still in the air, is known as the year without a summer, because that ash causes the weather to still be cold. So plants aren't growing, there's famine. And the eruption of Mount Tambora affected the light conditions all around the world and changed J.M.W. Turner. I always want to call him J.M.W. Turner or Bachman Overdrive, but it's just J.M.W. Turner. It totally changes his painting style, because here's how he drew and painted before: very distinct, very like the imagery is like lots of detail, easy to make out. And then after like 1816 and onward, his style is much more, and granted, in 1814, those ashes still aren't in the sky, but he was influenced by those changes in atmospheric conditions for the rest of his career. So this painting here is called The Slave Ship, and it's a real event. There was a slave ship called the Zong, and the boat they were running out of potable water provisions, I believe. So the captain of the ship figured like he could make more money, insurance money, on the slaves, dead slaves, if they like died overboard as opposed from dying from lack of water. So they just started throwing people into the water, and then some people who wanted to be in charge of their own destinies jumped in the water so that they themselves would be in charge of their own death. And like, I think it was like, I could be wrong, I think it's like 144 people died this way. And when the guy comes back, there's like a big to-do, and he goes to court, and Turner paints this painting to show like the inhumanity and horribleness of all of this. And it was things like this, and then we talked about ballet before, but it was things like this, that an exposure of this inhumanity that led to the abolition of the slave trade in Great Britain. So now moving on from that very serious subject, we're going to talk about relative value or value. So value has to do with how dark, how light something is, and relative value has to do with how dark or light something is in relationship to something else, usually something that is adjacent to it. So when you're looking at a painting, you can compare the relative value of one area to another area or object in the artwork. So when people are going to art school, they often have to learn how to make a grayscale using a pencil or other tool in order to be able to create and distinguish between a wide range of values. And again, we talked about that contrast in values helps to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional object. So contrast and value, how light or dark something is next to each other, separates objects in space. So this drawing of Chuck Close, this is his self-portrait, the majority of him, the lightness or darkness on him, is somewhat or significantly darker than the background. So that helps to separate him from the background. Gradations in value, and that has to do with like gradually going from light to dark. And this creates the illusion of three-dimensional volume or mass. So like we imagine there's a light source somewhere on the left. Maybe it's on the right. I'm sorry, my bad. It's on the right. There's a light source on the right. See how this is lighter, this is lighter, this is lighter. And the less light that's hitting the surface, the more in shadow it becomes. And you don't like abruptly, in this case, go from light to dark. You gradually go from light to dark in order to show like how the light is hitting that surface less and less and less as we move away from the light. So contrast in value, how light or dark something is next to each other, separates objects in space, and gradations in value mimic how much or how little light is hitting something, and it helps to create the illusion of three-dimensional mass and volume. So we're looking at these gradations and values on his nose, think, oh look, he has a booger, and like you can see where the light's hitting it. You can see where his glasses are covering up part of his nose. It gets darker. You can see the glasses are casting shadows over his eyes. So like there's gradations where we kind of slowly go from darker than lighter areas on his face, and that makes that nose, which is really on a flat piece of paper or canvas, look three-dimensional. So there's a method of painting called grisaille. And this is when an artist uses black or white, or often a color called burnt umber, mixed with like white and black to make the many variants gray. So first the artist will paint the scene thinking in terms of grayscale, how light or how dark something is. And then they do thin glazes of colors on top of that, and it creates like the illusion that this is three-dimensional. So a lot of times people will think, well, just because the color is a different color, well, then there must be like contrast and values, but that is not true. Because when we look at the color wheel here, we see all these different colors, but when we translate it to grayscale, all of a sudden we notice that red, purple, and purple, there's very little differences in those values. We notice that yellow, orange, and yellow, green, like if you squint through your eyes, they're close to the same value. That green and red, orange, they're not exactly the same. Green's a little darker, but they're very close in value. So when artists are painting, it's like really important that they realize that just because they're different colors doesn't mean there's contrast in value, and you need that contrast in value in order to separate things in space. And so they have to make adjustments to the colors, like either making the red, orange more yellow so it's brighter than the green, or making like a purple that's next to a red purple, making the red purple lighter so that they stand out against one another. So now we're going to talk about different ways that artists not only create the illusion of how much light or how little light is on a surface, but also the illusion of the shape of the object. So this first kind of way of doing it is called chiaroscuro. How do you like that? Italian. So chiaro means clear or light. Oscuro means obscure or dark. And this is a method of creating gradations in relative value, gradual changes from light to dark in relative value when shading the surface of an object. And when they do that, they're taking into consideration how much or how little light is hitting the surface. There's more light hitting it here. There's a little less light hitting it here. And gradually, as we move down, less and less light is hitting it. And then this bottom edge, well, the light that's coming from like either this side or is hitting that bottom edge. So they think about that, how little light is hitting it, but they also think about how the object is shaped. So when they're shading, if they're shading a sphere, they're not going to shade up and down and back and forth. They're going to follow the shape of the sphere when they're making their marks. And then the surface, this shadow that the sphere is casting on the table, well, the table's flat. So their marks are going more or less back and forth, but they're also drawn in perspective. But they're showing that this is a flat surface as opposed to this is a spherical shape. So chiaroscuro creates the illusion of a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface. These are examples by an artist named Charles White. He's doing, these are like drawings and lithographs on stone and charcoal drawings he did. So he's like going gradually, like their shirts are getting hit by light, parts of their arms are, and then gradually it becomes darker as it gets into more shadow. Here's this beautiful drawing of Eartha Kitt that he did for a movie that she was in with Sammy Davis Jr. I wish I remember the name of it, but it's a great movie. Here's some other examples. So, okay, this is again Dee Wiley. The background is not done in chiaroscuro. The background's done, it's like a pattern, and he wants it to look two-dimensional. The foreground, the man's face and neck and shirt, they've been done with chiaroscuro, where he's painting, like you don't see his brush strokes, but he's painting to depict the shape of the man's face, but also he is depicting how much or how little light is hitting the surface of that man's face. And he's doing these gradual gradations in the value of how light and how dark they are. He's not jumping from light to dark, he's gradually going from light to dark. This is a painting of, I believe, King Henry when he was a little boy, by Hans Holbein. He's doing the same thing, where he's doing these, you know, like he's casting a shadow back here, but then this area is lighter. He's like, depending on how much light or how little light's hitting the surface of his clothes. And he's also, even though it's hard for us to see, he's trying to make those brush marks follow the contours of the boy's head, his shirt, his vest, his hat. So let's go back to chiaroscuro. It's like gradually depicting how much light or how little light is hitting the surface. And it's also trying to conform to the shape of that surface when making its marks. Now there's another kind that's more extreme. It's called tenebroso, or tenebrism. Just forget that this even says chiaroscuro, because you're gonna get mixed up and you're gonna call it chiaroscuro. So just forget that. So in tenebrism, the main subject is illuminated by a single source of light, like there's a spotlight, and it leaves other areas in darkness to create this dramatic effect. Tenebrism will be often spiritual in nature, and although there are gradations in value, there's more extreme contrast between light and dark. Here's an example by Caravaggio, and it was made famous by him. So look, there's a super dark background, and there's a big jump between how dark that is and how light this person, St. John the Baptist's skin is. So there's this like really like high contrast between light and dark. Seems like he's lit by a spotlight, and it seems like it's from a heavenly source, because this is St. John the Baptist, and that like the spotlight is usually from above. So Caravaggio, or Michelangelo Maurici da Caravaggio, when he was a little boy, his entire family, with the exception of him, died of the plague. So he's pretty much on his own. And when he was 11, he joined a street gang, I love this, of painters and swordsmen. And, you know, like they're all pretty young kids, and they're, you know, teenagers, and their motto was without fear, without hope. So back then, you know, like there was a lot of violence. People were constantly threatening each other, like, you're in my territory, I'm going to kill you. So like gangs. And he begins as an artist apprentice. He jumps from, like, they had an apprentice system where you worked with a master artist, but he, until you got good, and then you become a journeyman artist where you're paid by the day, and then you do a masterpiece and you're a master artist. But he could not keep a job. So he's jumping from job to job. He's got problems with authority. He's always like getting in trouble. He like went to a restaurant, ordered artichokes, didn't like them, killed the waiter. Played tennis with somebody, got mad at the person he was playing tennis with, killed him. So, you know, you better not tangle with Caravaggio. But his work becomes like really influential. And at the same time he's becoming influential, there's a girl named Artemisia Gentileschi. Her dad's a painter, her brothers are painters. Her dad's really influenced by Caravaggio. Her brothers can go to school to study art, but she's a girl, so she can't. So her father decides to to hire somebody, a guy named Tossi, to, I'm going to get back to that in a minute, to teach her how to paint perspective and other techniques. And Tossi, he raped her. And back then, if you were a woman and you got raped, well, usually, well, that was it. But her dad was so angry, he decided to take it to court. And she was subjected to all sorts of things. She had to have in court a gynecological um, like exam to prove that she'd been a virgin. She also had thumb screws put on her, like, because they figured, like, well, the tighter the screws are on your thumb, the more you're going to tell the truth. But the long and short of it is they found Tossi guilty, which was unusual. But they only exiled him for a year. He had to pay like very little fine. So like all through her life, her paintings often portrayed women overcoming powerful men, and she's using the technique of tenebrism, where there's a very dark background. There appears to be a light, a spotlight coming in on the figures. And in this case of Judith slaying Holofernes, it's like a spotlight from above, a heavenly light. So like during this period where she was a painter, where Caravaggio was a painter, this is when the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church are splitting up. And the Catholic Church is like, we got to do something to get people in here. This is called the Baroque period. And they were like, you got to do more dramatic art to bring people back into churches. So they're, you know, like there'll be people like women cutting the head off of a guy. That's pretty dramatic. That doesn't bring people into church. So she did all these like laden, full of emotion paintings of usually women being like abused by men and then the women retaliating. So I like to show these two paintings. This is Caravaggio's on the left and Artemisia's on the right. And I always ask my face-to-face students, which of these looks more realistic? For me, it's Artemisia's, and I'll tell you why I think that, and you might have your own opinion. So here, Judith, she's like got her, she looks like, I don't want to do this. I'm cutting his head off. You know, like she looks like she's not really applying much pressure there. And then, and plus, like this old woman, like her handmaiden, she's just standing there. And this one, Artemisia and her maid, they're both in on the job, and they're like applying pressure. She's holding him down, and they're cutting off Holofernes's head for real here. And this blood is like a blood in a Japanese samurai movie, or in a Quentin Tarantino movie where it's squirting out. And this blood here, it seems pretty much more realistic. You would think Caravaggio knew what blood looked like since he was always going around killing people, but apparently he didn't. So I just wanted to show these two examples of chiaroscuro in a painting and tenebrism in a painting. These are the same story, David and Goliath. This one is like done in the daytime. There's gradual contrast between light and dark. True, there are areas that are dark, but that's because these areas are in shadow. And that this is lit by like the sunlight, but it could also be in a room and be chiaroscuro. This one, there's major contrast between the very light and the very dark. It appears to be a spotlight is lighting it from above, even though there are some gradual gradations in contrast, but it's more extreme lights and dark, and that spotlight in a dark room. So that's tenebrism. So let's look at a few other ways of doing depicting light. There's hatching or hatch marks. Now these are marks that so a lot of times you might be using a tool that you can't shade. So you can't shade with a pen. You can't shade with an etching needle on a zinc plate. So you have to do these hatch marks, and these are closely placed parallel lines that conforms to the shape of the object. Like these are curved because they're going around this finger, but they also depict the presence or absence of light. So no marks means direct light. And then as the light, as there's less light, the marks get closer and closer together and darker. And these hatch marks create a sense of 3D mass or volume. And here's some example of images that are using hatch marks, where they're these single marks closely placed next to one another. Then there's cross-hatching. A cross-hatching uses 2 sets of hatch marks, sometimes more, where, because like if we think about our finger is not only round, it goes up and down, it's got different contours, like different ways the planes are in the shape of the object. So these extra set of hatch marks also conforms to the shape of the object. Here, and they depict how much or how little light is hitting the surface of the object, and they create that sense of 3D volume and mass. So here's some examples of hatching by Michelangelo, where there's hatching and cross hatching, I'm sorry. So there'll be hatch marks, but there'll also be cross hatch marks. Here's some more examples of hatching and cross hatching. So in some instances, there's merely hatch marks. And then in other instances, there's marks that go over those original marks. Again, these are both like by, this is Elizabeth Catlin, I believe is one, and the other is Charles White. So there's proper ways to do cross-hatching and hatching, and there's improper ways. So if you're just using straight marks, this is an eye socket and a skull, well, those straight marks, those depict a flat surface, not a curved surface. So you have to make those marks follow the concaves and the contours of the object that you're shading. Here's another way of doing shading. Instead of doing those lines, you're doing marks, little stippling marks. So they're using like dots and dashes and other kinds of marks, and they're used in combination with cross hatching, but they also depict the shape of the object and how much or how little light is hitting it. This is a woman in Houston. She did these giant drawings with markers using stippling, but then they took her forever to do them, and then she got carpal tunnel syndrome, so she couldn't do them anymore. So the greater the contrast between light and dark, the more dramatic it will make the image. Just like those images that were done in Tenebroso or Tenebrism, they're very dramatic. And this is a photograph, so it's not using chiaroscuro and it's not using Tenebrism. It's just a black and white photograph. But because of the scene it shows, it's in a mosque, and the men are separated from the women. And this is a film still. This is a beautiful film, by the way. The men are primarily using white, and the women are having to wear these black chadors. And so there's this giant contrast between light and dark. Her face is very fair. So again, there's a giant contrast between light and dark. And the man she loves, he's in a dark suit. So there's this giant contrast between light and dark there. So when you maintain, we talked about this before, but when you maintain a range of values in color, it also helps you create the illusion of a more believable 3-dimensional space. And I believe that is the end of Chapter 5, Part 1, and tomorrow we'll go over Chapter 5, Part 2, and primarily focus on color. So see you tomorrow. Goodbye.